At 6:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the ramp of a landing craft dropped on Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach, below the bluffs near Vierville-sur-Mer. Men of Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, stepped into surf, smoke, machine gun fire, mortar bursts, and water already chopped white by bullets. Several had grown up in Bedford, Virginia, a town of about 3,200 people. They had trained for 3 years. They had crossed the channel in darkness. In the first minutes, the war stopped being global. It became one town's sons in one killing zone. The National D-Day Memorial records the arithmetic carefully. 37 young men from the town and county of Bedford belonged to Company A, 31 loaded into landing craft and headed for Omaha in the first wave. The remaining men were in supply details or later movements. Of the 26 who reached the beach in the intended assault, 16 were killed and 4 wounded within minutes. 3 more were unaccounted for and later presumed killed. Another Bedford soldier from Company F died elsewhere on Omaha Beach. By nightfall, Bedford's D-Day loss would be 20 men. 3 mysteries carry Bedford's story. Why were so many men from one small community in the same assault company? Why did some families wait nearly 6 weeks before the worst news reached them? And why did one Bible, found on Omaha Beach on June 7, become the object that carried the town's grief longer than any official telegram? Watch the Hoback brothers. Watch the Stevens twins. Watch a Western Union operator named Elizabeth Teass, because the second battle in this story did not happen in France. It happened behind a drugstore counter on Bridge Street. Before the war, Bedford was a county seat town in the Blue Ridge foothills, a place of courthouse business, churches, farms, storefronts, and young men who knew each other before they knew the army. Green's Drug Store on Bridge Street was a social center, with a soda fountain and a Western Union booth in the back. Boys who later landed at Omaha had bought ice cream there, met friends there, and passed through the same few blocks of downtown. That is the hidden structure of the Bedford story. The casualty list was not a list of strangers. Company A belonged to the Virginia National Guard's 116th Infantry Regiment. On February 3, 1941, the 116th was called into federal service as part of the 29th Infantry Division. The date mattered because America was not yet at war. The men left Bedford months before Pearl Harbor, expecting training, not a 3-year road to Normandy. Small-town guard units often carried local identity into the army. That could strengthen trust. It also created a terrible vulnerability. If one company was hit hard, one town could receive a concentrated share of the bill. Bedford and Raymond Hoback came from a farming family outside town. Their parents, John and Macy Hoback, had several children, including younger sister Lucille. Raymond carried a black leather Bible his mother had given him for Christmas in 1938. Bedford, the older brother, had the kind of first name that made later tellings feel almost too symbolic, but it was simply his name. They were not icons when they left home. They were sons, brothers, church-going country boys, and National Guardsmen folded into a federal army that was still learning what it would become. Roy and Ray Stevens were twins, another pair whose fate would become unbearable to summarize. They had grown up close enough that later accounts often treated their names as if they belonged together in a single breath. D-Day separated them. One twin would survive and carry the mourning for decades. The other would remain in Normandy. The Powers brothers, Jack and Clyde, formed another family pair in the Bedford Circle. War did not distribute risk evenly. It placed brothers in the same company, sometimes the same boat, and then asked families to wait for the mail. The men trained for a long time before they saw combat. The 29th Division arrived in the United Kingdom in 1942 and trained for amphibious assault through months of drills, route marches, inspections, and rehearsals. Company A learned boats, packs, weapons, beach exits, and the strange problem of fighting uphill from water. The training could make movements familiar, but it could not reproduce Dog Green. No exercise could put German machine guns in concrete positions above the beach, with surf dragging at a man's legs and 80 pounds of wet equipment pulling him down. Omaha Beach was divided into sectors with code names. Company A of the 116th was assigned to Dog Green, the western edge of the American beach below the Vierville draw. The plan expected naval and air bombardment to weaken German defenses before H hour. It expected engineers, tanks, and infantry to open exits through obstacles and across the sand. It expected timing. D-Day punished expectations. Smoke, current, navigational error, surviving German positions, and missed targets turned the neat assault tables into scattered men in front of guns that were still alive. The German defense was stronger than many men in the boats had been led to imagine. Elements of the 352nd Infantry Division were in the Omaha area, reinforcing coastal positions that Allied planners had not expected to be so dense. At Dog Green, the bluffs, draws, wire, mines, mortars, artillery, machine guns, and interlocking fields of fire made the beach less a landing zone than a funnel. The Americans had to leave boats, cross exposed sand, reach the shingle, and find routes upward. The first wave had to do all of that while the defense was fully awake. The final staging in England compressed home, fear, and routine into small tasks. Men waterproofed weapons, checked ammunition, marked equipment, packed assault vests, and carried personal items they were not supposed to need. Some wrote letters. Some smoked. Some joked because that was the only language available. Captain Taylor N. Fellers commanded Company A. The men knew their objective. They did not know that Dog Green would become one of the most lethal patches of sand in the American War. The next morning would decide which Bedford households remained ordinary and which became addresses on War Department forms. The crossing began before dawn on June 6. Assault troops moved from larger ships into landing craft that pitched in the channel. Seasickness hit hard. Men vomited into helmets, over ramps, and onto boots already heavy with gear. The cold did not feel cinematic. It crept through wool, canvas, socks, and fingers trying to keep a grip on rifles. The boats circled, formed, lost formation, and drove toward France. A man could not see Bedford from the channel. He could see the back of the man in front of him, a gray line of water, and eventually a coast under fire. The assault force was part of Operation Neptune, the seaborne portion of Overlord. That distinction mattered to no man in a landing craft, but it mattered to the scale around him. Thousands of vessels, minesweepers, escorts, transports, landing craft, and naval guns were moving on timed lanes toward 5 beaches. Company A occupied a tiny place inside that machinery. The larger invasion depended on coordination. Dog Green punished the smallest failures in that coordination. A boat a little late, a tank missing, a shell falling short, a current pushing wrong, each became personal. At H hour, Company A was supposed to land with other first-wave elements and push inland. Instead, several landing craft met disaster before or at the beach. National D-Day memorial accounts note that one landing craft struck an obstacle and sank, stranding dozens offshore, including 5 Bedford men. The rest pressed toward the beach. In some boats, bullets hit before ramps fell. In others, men stepped out and immediately entered deep water. A rifleman carrying wet gear was not a swimmer. He was a man trying not to drown before machine guns had their turn. Dog Green's first minutes were a collapse of the plan at human scale. The shingle was too far. The exits were blocked. The supporting tanks and engineers were too few, late, destroyed, or separated. Some men never fired around. Others fired at muzzle flashes they could barely locate. Company A's officers and non-commissioned officers were hit early, disrupting control when control mattered most. A German gunner did not know Bedford, Virginia. He saw shapes in surf and smoke. Bedford would later know his work by name, household, church, and empty chair. Among the dead were men whose names later became the town's permanent vocabulary: Bedford Hoback, Raymond Hoback, Ray Stevens, Frank Draper Jr., John Schenk, John Wilkes, Earl Parker, Jack Powers, Taylor Fellers, and others listed at the National D-Day Memorial. Another Bedford man, Benjamin Hubbard of Company F, was killed elsewhere on Omaha. The difference between 19 and 20 is not trivia. It reveals how memory and military paperwork classify grief. Company A's Bedford losses became the shorthand. Bedford's D-Day loss, counted across the beach, was one more. Roy Stevens survived. That sentence is simple only on paper. His twin, Ray, did not. Roy's survival became one of the ways Bedford could speak to itself after the war, because a living twin is also a daily absence. Other men survived because their boats sank offshore, because they were wounded, because they landed later, because they were assigned elsewhere, or because chance made a decision no officer could have made. Survival on Dog Green was not a clean moral category. It was timing, water depth, bullet angle, boat position, and the body beside you. By late morning, small groups had moved inland, and Omaha Beach was no longer the same battle it had been at 6:30. Destroyers came close. Survivors found draws, gaps, and ways up the bluff. The beachhead did not fail. That larger fact can obscure the smaller one. For Bedford, success on Omaha and ruin at Dog Green arrived together. Allied forces gained a foothold in France. Company A was shattered. Military history often holds both facts in one paragraph. A town has to hold them in kitchens, bedrooms, churches, and grocery lines. The 116th Infantry as a regiment paid heavily beyond Bedford. Virginia National Guard summaries note that more than 800 members of the 116th were killed, wounded, or missing during the D-Day assault on Omaha Beach. Company A's destruction was part of that broader regimental cost. The Bedford story should not erase other towns, other companies, or the regular Army soldiers on Omaha. Its force comes from concentration, not exclusivity. Bedford suffered a uniquely concentrated home front wound inside a larger American disaster that stretched from Dog Green to Easy Red. But the worst was still coming, and not for the enemy. The families in Bedford did not know the scale of the loss on June 6. Newspapers reported the invasion. Radios carried broad news. The town knew its men were in the assault, but official death notification moved through channels, verification, clerks, forms, and telegram routes. A mother could hear that D-Day had succeeded and still not know whether her son was alive. That gap between public victory and private certainty lasted for weeks. The waiting became Bedford's second battlefield. In Bedford, the Western Union office operated from Green's drugstore. The Bedford Boys Tribute Center identifies the operator as Elizabeth Teass, 21 years old in July 1944. On July 17, she entered the small wooden telegraph booth expecting ordinary messages and began receiving War Department notices. The repeated opening line became a local wound, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." The words were standardized, designed for national scale. In Bedford, national scale came through one machine, one strip of paper at a time. The telegrams did not arrive as one clean historical tableau. Some accounts placed the first Hoback notification on Sunday, July 16, with others following July 17. The difference matters because grief in real life is not organized for anniversaries. John and Macy Hoback learned first that Bedford had been killed. Raymond was initially listed missing. The Army would later confirm his death, but Raymond's body was not recovered and identified. The family received one kind of certainty and one kind of uncertainty, both attached to the same morning on a beach 3,800 miles away. Elizabeth Teass had a job that no training could make bearable. A telegram operator did not write the War Department's decisions, but she was the first local person to see the sentences. The Clio entry for Green's drugstore describes her being stunned as one message followed another. The drugstore had once been a place of soda fountain noise and teenage errands. In July 1944, it became the place where Bedford's private losses entered town space. The machine in the back room made no judgment. It typed names faster than people could absorb them. Delivery became its own burden on July 17. Local men carried the envelopes to farms and houses because the families had to know before rumors did. Sheriff, undertaker, drugstore employee, neighbor, minister, accounts differ in the details, but not in the meaning. Bedford had no way to outsource the news. The people delivering the telegrams knew the families receiving them. They knew the roads, porches, kitchens, and children in the yard. A city can absorb a casualty notice into anonymity. Bedford could not. Every delivery had a map of personal memory attached to it. The Hoback family received a different object in August 1944. Harold Crayton of the 453rd Amphibian Truck Company had found Raymond Hoback's Bible on Omaha Beach on June 7. He mailed it to John and Macy Hoback after finding their names and Bedford address inside. In his letter, quoted by the National D-Day Memorial, Crayton wrote that he was sending it back knowing you no doubt would want the book returned. He added that most Bibles were a book to be cherished. Crayton did not know Raymond was already dead. Raymond's Bible became Bedford's most intimate artifact because it was not official. A telegram told a family what the government knew. The Bible told them where their son had been. It carried salt, sand, handling, and an address written before the invasion. Lucille Hoback Boggess later told Alex Kershaw, as quoted by the National D-Day Memorial, "My mother always treasured the Bible so much." That sentence is small, but it explains why the object survived in the family for nearly 80 years before being donated to the memorial in 2023. Lucille was 14 years old when her brothers were killed. In a later CBS interview, she remembered the second telegram being delivered by a cab driver, a detail so ordinary that it makes the moment worse. Bedford did not receive its war news through a grand military ceremony. It came by teletype, sheriff's car, cab, neighbor, and envelope. A teenager in the Hoback family watched adults absorb sentences that had been written in Washington and routed through machines. That is why the home front part of the story belongs beside the beach, not after it. The bodies and graves did not resolve everything. Some Bedford men were buried in Normandy. Some were returned later. Some were never recovered. Raymond Hoback remains among those without an identified body. Bedford Hoback's fate is recorded differently in family and military memory because recovery, identification, and notification did not happen at the same pace. The Normandy American Cemetery at Vierville-sur-Mer became a place where Bedford could locate part of its loss. But a cemetery overseas does not replace a body at home. It gives grief an address in another country. The town's public rituals developed slowly. Bedford did not immediately become a national symbol. It became a place where families carried private losses in ordinary patterns: church, work, school, meals, and silence. The Bedford Bulletin, local churches, and veterans' gatherings kept names alive long before tourists arrived. Some survivors did not want to speak. Some relatives could not stop speaking. Both responses were forms of memory. The town's grief was too concentrated to disappear, but too painful to turn quickly into ceremony. It had to sit in houses before it could stand on a memorial hill. Roy Stevens became one of the men who carried the story forward, but he did not do it easily. Survivors of Omaha often returned with damaged hearing, injured bodies, nightmares, and a reluctance to turn one day into a public performance. When Roy spoke of Ray, the account was not only military. It was twinship cut in half. The memorial movement came later. Robert "Bob" Slaughter, a D-Day veteran from nearby Roanoke, became one of the driving figures behind a national memorial to the Normandy invasion. Bedford's losses made the location symbolically powerful, and Congress designated Bedford as the site in the 1990s. The National D-Day Memorial Foundation emphasizes that the memorial received no federal funding for construction. That matters. The National Monument was built through private fundraising, local commitment, veterans advocacy, and a belief that one small town could stand for many American homefronts. On June 6, 2001, the National D-Day Memorial was dedicated in Bedford with President George W. Bush in attendance. The date was the 57th anniversary of the invasion. Bush's remarks included a line the memorial still quotes, "Not on a battlefield of war, but in a small Virginia town." The memorial's design leads visitors through invasion, sacrifice, and victory. Its most recognizable feature is the Overlord Arch, rising above plazas, water, sculpture, and names. The site sits on more than 50 acres above Bedford, with views toward the surrounding mountains and town. For visitors, the place can feel quiet. For families, it is not abstract. A bronze figure in the water, a wall of names, and Raymond Hoback's Bible connect Normandy to a Virginia address. The memorial's power comes from making global war walkable at human scale. The names listed by the memorial include Leslie Abbott Jr., Wallace Carter, John Clifton, Frank Draper Jr., Taylor Fellers, Nick Gillespie, Bedford Hoback, Raymond Hoback, Clifton Lee, Earl Parker, Jack Powers, Weldon Rosaza, John Reynolds, John Schenk, Ray Stevens, John Wilkes, Gordon White Jr., Elmire Wright, Grant Yop, and Benjamin Hubbard. Read quickly, they become a roster. Read slowly, they become the town's map. Each name points back to a household, a street, a church, a school desk, or a family that had to answer when visitors asked which one was theirs. The memorial also corrects a common oversimplification. It does not reduce the Bedford story to a slogan about 19 men in 15 minutes. Its own account explains the distinctions: 37 Bedford men in Company A, 31 in first-wave landing craft, 16 killed and 4 wounded within minutes after reaching Omaha, 3 later presumed killed, and 1 additional Bedford soldier killed elsewhere on the beach. The distinctions do not reduce the loss. They protect the men from being flattened into an easy number. The truth is more complicated and more severe. Lucille Hoback Boggess became one of the human links between the families and the memorial. She lost both brothers on D-Day, helped preserve Raymond's Bible, served in Bedford public life, and remained connected to the National D-Day Memorial Foundation. In 2023, she donated Raymond's Bible, Crayton's letter, and the Missing in Action telegram to the memorial collection. That act mattered because she did it while alive. The artifact moved from family possession into public memory with the family's consent, not as something taken by war but as something entrusted after decades. Lucille died on November 19, 2025, at age 96, according to her obituary and local reporting. By then, she had lived long enough to see the 80th anniversary commemorations of D-Day and to place Raymond's Bible where visitors could learn from it. Her life complicates the idea that D-Day ended in 1944. For the families, D-Day continued through marriages, elections, interviews, fundraising, ceremonies, and decisions about artifacts. Lucille's brothers died in minutes on June 6. Her obligation to them lasted more than 8 full decades. Her obituary also records a civic life that outgrew the role of grieving sister without leaving it behind. Lucille worked for Bedford County, became the first woman elected to countywide office there in 1967, later served on the Board of Supervisors, and helped the National D-Day Memorial from its founding years. That matters because memory was not the only work she did. She lived a full public life, and still the deaths of Bedford and Raymond remained part of her public duty. Bedford's story did not freeze her. It followed her. The Bible's public display also changed the meaning of the memorial's sculpture Death on Shore, which depicts a fallen soldier near water with a Bible beside him. The National D-Day Memorial notes that Raymond's Bible inspired the sculpture. That matters because sculpture can universalize a story, while the actual Bible makes it specific again. The object says this was not just any soldier. It was Raymond Hoback, son of John and Macy, brother of Lucille, a man whose name and address were written inside a book another soldier could not leave in the sand. The hidden consequence of Bedford reached beyond Bedford. The story became part of the American argument over hometown units and the cost of keeping local men together. The Army did not simply erase local identity after World War II, but modern personnel systems became more careful about concentrated community loss. Bedford stands as a warning about what happens when military cohesion and local recruitment align with catastrophic combat. The men fought as a company. The town mourned as a company. The tactical advantage of familiarity became a homefront wound. Bedford's loss is often described as the highest known per capita D-Day loss suffered by an American community. That wording is important. It is not a claim that no community in any war suffered more. It is a claim about American D-Day losses measured against wartime population. The distinction keeps the statement honest and still leaves it devastating. A town of roughly 3,200 people lost 20 men on June 6, 1944. Scaled to a large city, the number becomes almost impossible to hear. In Bedford, it was already impossible enough. By 2026, Green's Drug Store has become part of the Bedford Boys Tribute Center story, and the National D-Day Memorial continues to receive visitors, students, veterans, and families. The landscape has changed. The old telegram technology is museum material. The men who fought are gone or nearly gone. But the structure of the story remains legible. A town sends men together. A beach receives them together. A telegraph machine returns them as messages. A memorial tries, decades later, to put names back where numbers had begun to harden. The Normandy side of the story also remains active. The graves at Vierville-sur-Mer are maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. Visitors still walk above Omaha Beach, look down toward the sand, and then read names in rows of white markers. For Bedford families, Normandy is not only battlefield tourism. It is a second geography of kinship. Some men have known graves there. Some do not. A visitor can stand in Bedford, then travel to Normandy, and realize the distance between the two places is part of the wound. The distance also shapes how descendants learn the story. A child in Bedford can visit the memorial after school, see the Overlord Arch, and hear that Omaha Beach is across an ocean. A relative in Normandy can stand near the actual sand and understand why the memorial is in Virginia. Neither place is complete by itself. One holds the terrain of death. The other holds the terrain of absence. Between them is the Atlantic route the men crossed once, and families have crossed in memory ever since. The hardest part of the Bedford story is that it has no single correct emotional scale. A military historian can discuss Dog Green, the 116th Infantry, the 29th Division, the 352nd Infantry Division, H-hour, fire support, and beach exits. A family member may only need one name. Both scales are true. The danger is letting the larger one swallow the smaller. That is why the memorials list matters. Names resist abstraction. They force the viewer to slow down. Bedford's real argument with history is not about loss. It is about pace. There is one more fact that changes the shape of the story. The Bedford boys were not all boys. Some were husbands. Some were fathers. Some had jobs, debts, plans, and histories longer than the nickname suggests. The phrase survives because it carries tenderness, but it can also make grown men sound like symbols. Wallace Carter had children. Frank Draper Jr. had a family. Taylor Fellers carried command responsibility. The town did not lose a set of mythic youths. It lost specific adults and almost adults who had occupied real places in other people's lives. The telegram formula shows the distance between government and household. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret was meant to serve millions. It had to be formal, repeatable, and legally clear. In Bedford, repetition made it unbearable. The same sentence entered house after house, carrying different names but the same official rhythm. That is the moral tension in casualty notification. A nation requires procedure because war is too large for improvisation. A family receives the procedure as a sentence that divides life into before and after. Raymond Hoback's Bible did the opposite. It was not repeatable. It could not be standardized. It was one object, found by one soldier, mailed to one family, and kept because Macy Hoback needed something her son had touched. Crayton's letter expressed sympathy without knowing the whole story. That ignorance makes the package more painful. He hoped Raymond might already have written home saying he was well. By the time the Bible reached Bedford, the family was learning that one son was dead and the other was missing. The book arrived as proof and question together. The public story of Bedford widened through Alex Kershaw's 2003 book The Bedford Boys and through repeated D-Day anniversaries, but local memory was older than publicity. Families had preserved letters, photographs, uniforms, Bibles, and silences long before national audiences arrived. That sequence matters. Popular history did not create the grief. It translated it outward. The danger of translation is simplification. The benefit is survival. Without books, museums, and ceremonies, the names might remain local only. With them, the names risk becoming content. Bedford has lived inside that trade-off for decades. The National D-Day Memorial Foundation's educational mission now sits inside that trade-off. Its job is to teach D-Day without making Bedford a slogan, and to teach Bedford without narrowing D-Day to one town. That balance is hard. The landings involved American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces, sailors, airmen, soldiers, engineers, medics, and civilians, success and terrible error. Bedford's story is a doorway into that scale, not a replacement for it. A visitor who begins with the Hoback Bible should leave with Omaha, Normandy, and the whole invasion larger, not smaller. So here is the question Bedford leaves us with. When one town sends neighbors in the same company, loses them on the same beach, receives them back as telegrams, graves, missing bodies, and one salt-stained Bible, what does remembrance owe to the men themselves? Is it enough to say 20 from Bedford died on D-Day, or do we have to keep saying Bedford Hoback, Raymond Hoback, Ray Stevens, Frank Draper Jr., John Schenk, and every other name slowly enough that the number never gets there first?